A verse-by-verse study in the Book of Proverbs, ESV, with Irv Risch, Chapter 1. What does Proverbs Chapter 1 mean? To fully understand Proverbs, it is important to define 4 key terms used throughout the book. These words are often used interchangeably in English, but in the Book of Proverbs they tend to have individual meanings. The 4 terms are learning, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Learning, as used in Proverbs, is the simple acquisition of information. This could be defined as short-term memory. Anything absorbed for a specific use and then discarded, like a phone number, is this kind of learning. It is needed for a specific purpose. When that purpose is over, the information is forgotten. However, if that phone number belonged to a best friend or spouse and was called on a regular basis, it would move from short-term memory into long-term memory. This is what Proverbs refers to as knowledge, or any information that is retained for later use. Wisdom is the capacity for action produced because of knowledge. Solomon asked for wisdom so that he could govern God's people. God acknowledges that this wisdom is given to Solomon so that he can properly rule God's people. Therefore, as used in the Book of Proverbs, wisdom is the ability to make appropriate and compassionate actions, based upon knowledge. Note that this is an ability, not a guarantee. Solomon possessed extraordinary wisdom. But as the book of Ecclesiastes shows, he did not always choose to listen to it. The opposite of wisdom, folly, or foolishness, is inappropriate action founded in selfish and sinful desire. It is acting against wisdom, rather than according to it. Finally, understanding is the complete knowledge of a subject with a responsibility to pass on that knowledge. Only after something is learned, retained, and used wisely, can it be taught to others. The Book of Proverbs, therefore, is the fullness of understanding. Solomon was gifted with great wisdom, which he handed down, through Proverbs, to his sons' sons, and to all of the generations. One of the great ironies of human experience is that we can gain wisdom, fail to use it, and the pain of that experience can generate a better understanding, which we are then compelled to tell others about. Proverbs 1 verses 1 to 7 outlines the 4 distinct statements, or purpose statements of the Book of Proverbs. This section culminates with the identification of the only source of true wisdom, the Lord Himself. The purpose of the Book of Proverbs is to recognize wise instruction and apply knowledge wisely. Most importantly, this all begins with a reverent respect, fear, of the Lord and the rejection of foolish ways. Proverbs 1 verses 8 to 19 is a warning against foolishness and the allure of sinful behavior. Solomon begins this warning by appealing to his children to honor their parents' teaching. As most parents know, it's helpful to outline negative behavior before stating what happens when one engages in it. Proverbs 1 verses 20 to 33 concludes the first chapter of Proverbs. This passage lists the dire consequences of the behaviors defined in the previous section. This section of Scripture is a famous and important metaphor, the first personification of wisdom, as a woman. Throughout Proverbs, Solomon describes wisdom as a beautiful woman shouting out for others to hear. The point of this imagery is that wisdom is not hiding. It is out in the open for all to hear, even though it often goes overlooked. To understand the Book of Proverbs, it is essential to consider the human author, Solomon. The first chapter of 2 Chronicles records the conversation between God and Solomon shortly after Solomon has been named the new king of Israel, 2 Chronicles 1 verse 10. Solomon's request for wisdom and knowledge, in order to govern God's people, shows his humility before the Lord, and God responds with a promise as well as a blessing, 2 Chronicles 1 verses 11 to 12. Thanks to Solomon's humble approach, the Lord blessed him abundantly. He was given not only what he asked for, wisdom and knowledge, but also the other blessings he didn't mention, riches, possessions, and honor. True to the nature of God, none have been as wise as Solomon before or since, 1 Kings 3 verse 12. However, even with his wisdom, Solomon turned away from God and followed after worldly pursuits. 1 Kings 11 records that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Through his life, he found no earthly pleasure to replace the love of God. In Ecclesiastes 1 verse 2, Solomon proclaims, "Vanity of vanities. All is vanity." The Book of Proverbs, therefore, is a collection of wise instructions to Solomon's sons, based on his knowledge and experience, so that they can avoid his foolish mistakes. While Solomon had great wisdom and knowledge, he did not always apply his knowledge wisely. Solomon used his power and influence to get what he wanted, even though he knew it was not wise to do so. Therefore, consider the words of Proverbs carefully. They are divinely inspired, penned by the wisest man to ever live, with a wisdom given fully by the Lord himself. Of the books of wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job, the Book of Proverbs is the easiest to understand while providing an incomparable amount of knowledge to the reader. The Book of Proverbs also makes a great family devotional book as it has 31 chapters. One chapter can be studied each day throughout a month. Altogether, there are 915 verses in the Book of Proverbs. If a chapter a day seems too much to read, studying 2 or 3 verses a day will take about a year. Chapter context. Proverbs chapter 1 is clearly born out of Solomon's life history. Solomon held himself back from no earthly pleasure, he had everything he could ever desire, and in the end he saw the foolishness of his actions. Chapter 1 is Solomon's reflection on his own life, how he had all the wisdom of God available to him, and yet chose to follow after foolish desires. Other chapters detail the advice which this experience allows Solomon to give. Verse by verse. Verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. This verse specifically identifies Solomon, David's son and legitimate heir to the throne, as the author of the Book of Proverbs. This is important because of God's promise to David, found in 2 Samuel 7 verses 11 to 16. Through Nathan the prophet, God made 3 promises to David. First, that his son, Solomon, would build the temple of God, 2 Samuel 7 verse 13. Second, that his son would turn away from him, but that God would discipline him as a father and not remove his love from him, 2 Samuel 7 verses 14 to 15. And third, that David's house would be established forever, 2 Samuel 7 verse 16. This final promise is a messianic prophecy, but is still a very important part of Solomon's lineage. Solomon was given incredible intelligence and wisdom by God, 1 Kings 3 verses 1 to 15, 2 Chronicles 1 verses 7 to 13. Unfortunately, though wisdom is the capacity to do right, Solomon didn't always choose correctly. The book of Ecclesiastes details some of his experiences, and his discovery that God's ways really are the best ways after all. Context summary. Proverbs 1 verses 1 to 7 outlines the 4 distinct statements, or purpose statements of the Book of Proverbs. This section culminates with the identification of the only source of true wisdom, the Lord himself. The purpose of the Book of Proverbs is to recognize wise instruction and apply knowledge wisely. Most importantly, this all begins with a reverent fear of the Lord and the rejection of foolish ways. Verse 2. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight. The 4 steps of awareness, in Proverbs, are learning, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Learning is acquiring raw information. Knowledge is information that has been remembered for future use. Wisdom is the capacity to make right choices, based in knowledge and information. Understanding is a deeper form of wisdom, which can be passed along to others. This verse begins the purpose statements of the Book of Proverbs. The first purpose is to learn. However, it is more than just picking up random facts, it is the recognition of wise teaching. The 2 phrases used in verse 2 are to know and to understand. Solomon is not jumping ahead in the learning knowledge wisdom understanding process. He is simply instructing the reader that this book is written to help them recognize and discern wise instruction. In essence, the Book of Proverbs is a tool. The principles it gives can be used to measure other instructions. Verse 3. To receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity. This verse gives 4 terms which take learning to a new level. In verse 2, the reader is instructed to use Proverbs to discern and identify wise instruction. Wise dealing is from the Hebrew haskell, literally meaning prudence, instruction, or wisdom. In verse 3, Solomon urges the reader to receive that instruction, or to commit the information to knowledge. The Hebrew phrase translated, to receive instruction, is la kahat muser, literally meaning, to teach or cause intelligence. This is the character trait of learning to learn. That transition occurs through instruction in 4 character traits: wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity. Righteousness is also a causative term and means morality or justice. Receiving righteousness is learning to live a moral life. The word translated as justice means discretion or determination. It is the term used for a verdict or judgment. The third character trait to receive is discernment, or the ability to judge information and situations. Finally, equity means prosperity and agreement. This character trait is about treating others equitably, but does not mean blanket equality. Instead, this translates to something more like fairness. To be fair means to give to one what he is due. In tandem, these 4 traits outline the second purpose of the Book of Proverbs. We are to receive the ability to learn, live moral lives, discern the right course of action, and treat others according to what they deserve. Verse 4. To give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Here begins development of the major theme of the Book of Proverbs, wisdom. In verses 2 and 3 we were instructed to know and to receive, both internal processes. In contrast, verse 4 encourages us to give. Here Solomon instructs us to respond with action, rooted in the knowledge we will receive throughout the book. The 4 steps of awareness are learning, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Learning is acquiring raw information. Knowledge is information that has been remembered for future use. Wisdom is the capacity to make right choices, based in knowledge and information. Understanding is a deeper form of wisdom, which can be passed along to others. To act wisely is to put knowledge into practice. What is it that we are to give, according to this verse? We are to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discernment to the youth. Solomon is clearly describing that with knowledge, action is required. That action is to live wisely, showing discretion and discernment to those younger or less informed than you. The term simple here does not mean stupid. Rather, it refers to someone uneducated or unaware. The same term is often translated as inexperienced or naive. Verse 5. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. This is a transition verse. Unlike verses 3, 4, and 6, verse 5 does not contain one of the purpose, to, statements. Instead it shows the transition from wisdom to understanding. The first 3 stages, knowing wise teaching, receiving that instruction into knowledge, and acting wisely, now take a dramatic turn. Solomon is going to give his children a directive which comes with this wisdom. Once one is wise and increases in knowledge, they now have a responsibility to pass that knowledge on. The ideal motivation of seeking wisdom is not so much obtaining it for ourselves, but attaining a position where we can guide others. Those who have knowledge and understanding have an inherent responsibility to guide, or give, wise counsel. We should not bottle up our wisdom and hide it. We must train others, likewise, to live wisely. For those who have earned their experience at great cost, as Solomon did, this is a very heartfelt request. Especially when dealing with our own children, we desperately want to be sure they do not make the same mistakes we did. In no uncertain terms, we beg them to pay attention to our advice, which is based on hard experience. Verse 6. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. Verse 6 relates the final purpose statement of Proverbs, to understand. Solomon encourages his children to reach the level of understanding outlined in the previous verse. This requires passing that knowledge along to others. The first purpose of Proverbs is to discern right teaching. The second purpose is to live according to appropriate character traits founded in that teaching. The third purpose is to give back a good example by acting wisely. The final purpose is to be intentional about teaching others, restarting the cycle of learning. In short, the purpose of the Book of Proverbs is empowering us to obtain understanding, so that we may pass on wisdom to the next generation. A key term for understanding all of Proverbs is the Hebrew word hida. This is most often translated as riddle, or, in the KJV, as dark saying. Hida refers to a figure of speech or other indirect statement. Specifically, it means a statement which requires careful interpretation. According to the Book of Proverbs, a key component of wisdom is the ability to correctly interpret statements which may or may not be meant to be taken in a simple-minded way. Verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, fools despise wisdom and instruction. Verse 7 concludes the introduction to the Book of Proverbs. This verse is the cornerstone of the entire book. Solomon is making an absolute statement against any knowledge that takes precedence over the Lord. The use of fear, in this context, is not meant to imply a sense of horror, despair, or fright. It is a strong term, for sure. Here, it points more towards a sense of extreme respect. This is the sense in which mature adults fear things like fire, knives, or chemicals. It's not panic and terror, but does come with a suggestion of consequences. According to the Bible, true knowledge cannot exist without a reverent fear of God. Certainly there are many very intelligent individuals who do not follow God, so this statement can seem contradictory. In the original Hebrew phrasing, the beginning does not point to knowledge, but instead belongs with the fear of the Lord. The same phrase can be more literally translated as giving priority to. In this context, the term beginning means the chief place in time, space, and order. The contention here is not that one cannot obtain knowledge apart from God. Instead, this implies that knowledge is out of place apart from the fear of the Lord. Knowledge itself can become an idol and take the chief place in one's life, Romans 1 verse 22. Solomon learned throughout his life that there is a vast difference between worldly knowledge and godly wisdom, 1 Corinthians 1 verse 25. In this book, he is warning us to put things in the proper order. The fear of the Lord is the beginning, it should hold the chief position, the place of priority in our lives, and then we will obtain knowledge and put it into its proper place. However, just because knowledge should not overtake the Lord in priority, we are not to despise wise instruction. Instead, when everything is in its proper place, we will fear the Lord, obtain knowledge, and enjoy wise instruction. Verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction and forsake not your mother's teaching. Exodus 20 verse 12 commands us to honor our mother and father. This goes beyond simple obedience, and includes the ideas of respect and consideration. In the New Testament Paul points out to us that this command is the first which comes with a promise, Ephesians 6 verses 1-4. Paul also commands fathers to raise their children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Here in the first chapter of Proverbs, we see Solomon giving the same exhortation to follow the wise instruction of your parents. This suggestion is especially poignant, coming from Solomon. Although he was blessed by God with incredible wisdom, 2 Chronicles 1 verses 11-12, Solomon didn't always choose to use it. The book of Ecclesiastes records how he pursued many things, other than God, and found them to be empty and pointless, Ecclesiastes 2 verses 9-11. In the end, Solomon came to the conclusion that following God's will is by far the most important goal of our lives, Ecclesiastes 12 verses 13 to 14. Context summary: Proverbs 1 verses 8 to 19 is a warning against foolishness and the allure of sinful behavior. Solomon begins this warning by appealing to his children to honor their parents' teaching. As any parent knows, it's often best to outline a negative behavior before stating the consequences of that behavior. The example used seems extreme, but it is meant to point towards an obvious conclusion. Verse 9. For they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. Verse 9 likens our parents to a garland or a pendant. This custom of adorning oneself with jewelry has not changed much in thousands of years. Jewelry is a status symbol and serves as an item of beautification. Solomon gives a clear picture that parents, more specifically the instructions of parents, are not to be despised. Instead, they should be seen as treasures. The wise instructions of a parent, like fine jewelry, are often obtained at great cost. They have history, value, and can even be passed along to future generations. Further, those who actively use the wisdom of their parents will see it reflected in their lives. Other people will notice the wise choices, wise behavior, and wise words, just as someone will notice the fine jewelry a person puts on. In terms of wisdom, this is far better than jewelry, since wisdom can be spread to others who see it and learn from it. Verse 10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. There is a small, easily misunderstood term hidden here in verse 10, if. Immediately after exalting the merits of parental instruction, Solomon quickly makes this decisive statement. In Hebrew, the term translated as if is a widely used demonstrative term, im. This word is used frequently in Hebrew writing when one wishes to demonstrate a point. While we translate it often as if in English, it can also mean doubtless if, moreover if, or even when. The word is meant to imply a hypothetical, a situation that is not, yet, but may or probably will be. In more literal English, Solomon is not saying, if sinners entice you, he is saying, when sinners entice you. And we can all agree that sin has enticed us throughout our lives. The parental command here is not to consent to sin, not to go willingly into it. It advises us to use our wisdom and act according to our knowledge, taught to us by our parents and found in the Scriptures. Verse 11. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without reason. Verses 11 to 14 represent a fictitious quote Solomon uses as an example. His suggestion sounds over the top, so much so that a reader may say, no one would ever be attracted to these things. However, what is dangerous are the lures used in each verse. Solomon exaggerates in order to make the point clear. The proper response to these temptations should be obvious, but it is not always so easy. Recognizing them in an extreme example gives us perspective to see them in less radical scenarios. Verse 11 is about the concept of peer pressure. This sets up the warning that enticement is often a group effort. This is the, come on, everyone is doing it, theme of our day. Countless evil things have been excused on the grounds that many people were involved. The sinner says, come with us, and let us. Even though what they appear to be doing is grotesque, Solomon is making the point that the group mentality is seductive. Against one or two people, we may be able to stand firm, but when a group is egging us on, it is much harder to resist. Verse 12. Like Sheol let us swallow them alive and whole, like those who go down to the pit. This verse carries the theme of verse 11 to another level. Solomon is still using an exaggerated scenario, for a reason. The obvious response here is meant to show how we ought to respond to foolishness and sin. This is meant to be applied anywhere we are tempted, not only in cases of obvious evil. Verse 11 brought up the dangers of peer pressure, the group mentality. Not only is the group mentality still in play here in verse 12, but now a new incentive is given. Here, the excuse changes to suggest that the people were doing this to have it coming. This is another reason human beings have used to excuse evil actions, the claim that two wrongs make a right. This even applies in seemingly positive ways. It's the reason we applaud Robin Hood for stealing, because he is stealing from the rich and greedy. Here in this verse, the tempting sinner is stating that the people being ambushed are going down to the pit anyway, so we might as well teach them a lesson. And yet, these were the same people described in verse 11 as the innocent, showing how sin will twist anything in order to justify itself. Verse 13. We shall find all precious goods, we shall fill our houses with plunder. This verse changes the game a bit. Now, the lure shifts to what you will get out of it. The incentive becomes the personal benefits of sin. The fictional sinner speaks of the riches that you will come by, and what will be found. At this point, we see that the temptation has all the makings of a common manipulation tactic. First, you won't be alone, we will do it together. Second, they really have it coming anyway. Third, we will get rich in the process. It would be easy for anyone to fall into this trap and be enticed by sin. Many people, in fact, have fallen into sin for these very reasons. All too often, that starts with a desire for the riches or the benefits. The rest is just an attempt to justify our sin. Very few people participate in sin because they think it is wrong and that it will lead to disaster. We justify our actions in an effort to say they really aren't bad, or at least, not that bad. And we fool ourselves into thinking that we can get away with it, without any consequences. Solomon uses an extreme example to make a point, but the same silly thinking, and the same proper response, is meant to apply to us, even in less outrageous situations. Verse 14. Throw in your lot among us, we will all have one purse. This verse ends with the typical promise of sin, throw in with us and we will all share in the plunder. Of course, in the real world, this isn't just unlikely, it's impossible. Sin never leads to all of the glorious outcomes it promises. There is no legitimate get-rich-quick scheme. Nobody engaged in sin and evil is going to fairly share with other sinners. Yet, this kind of approach continues to sell to the easily manipulated community. This, of course, means each one of us, which is the reason Proverbs brings this warning so early and so strongly. Obviously, the Book of Proverbs, along with the rest of the Bible, realizes that sin does sometimes result in temporary benefits, Psalm 73 verse 3, Hebrews 11 verse 25. More often than not, though, it leads to ruin and suffering, Galatians 6 verse 8. And, of course, rejection of God will ultimately lead to eternal damnation, Mark 8 verse 36, John 12 verse 48. Even though Solomon's example seems extreme, he uses it to explain many of the ways in which temptation can attack us. When understood this way, the enticement to sin is quite real. The purpose of the example is to help us recognize and reject those sales tactics, peer pressure, ends justifying the means, personal gain, and glory. Verse 15. My son, do not walk in the way with them, hold back your foot from their paths. This is Solomon's plea to his children to not even pay attention to these kinds of temptations. The terms he uses here are, do not walk, and, hold back your foot. In other words, don't even let them get a word out, don't listen at all, stay completely away from the path. In no way, shape, or form should we cooperate with those who are pursuing evil. Again, the fact that this is coming from Solomon has to be kept in mind. His personal history was one of a man who experimented with pleasure, power, and sin. In the end, he found all of those to be a waste of time. Solomon knows from experience that once you start on the wrong path it is very difficult to get off of it. The father's plea then is to stay away from the path to begin with. This is an all too common plea from parents to their children, don't make the same mistakes I did. Verse 16. For their feet run to evil and they make haste to shed blood. This warning is a reference back to verses 11 to 14. Even though the lures are tempting, the type of people who run to evil will take you down with them. There is no honor among thieves. They will do anything to get ahead, including shedding blood, even your blood. Those who persist in willful evil should be avoided at all costs. While this might seem like common sense, Solomon's warning is meant to expose how even the worst sinners will tempt others to join them. Even when the stakes are not as high, or don't seem to be, this principle still applies. The Book of Proverbs will explore this idea again, Proverbs 13 verse 20. The New Testament gives similar advice, from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 33, bad company ruins good morals. This is why Solomon warns to not even walk a single step in that path. Every moment spent with those who are trying to tempt you to evil is another moment closer to spiritual and tangible ruin. Verse 17. For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. Here, Solomon shows the plans of evil people to be foolishness. Solomon desperately wants to point out that all their promises are in vain. He uses the simple example of the bird. Even that ignorant animal is smart enough not to be caught in a trap when it watches the hunter set it up. Thinking one can escape obvious disaster is foolish. Only the fool will be taken by the temptation of these sinners. Sadly, human beings are prone to making exactly these kinds of ridiculous mistakes. Verse 18. But these men lie in wait for their own blood, they set an ambush for their own lives. Solomon reinforces the concept that those who plan to do evil will undoubtedly harm themselves. These people are out for selfish gain, and they will meet a selfish end. The trap that they set for others, in the end, will tangle them up. This is a major theme of biblical morality. Nobody gets away with it. Trying to get ahead by defying God will only lead to disaster, Mark 8 verse 36. All sin will be punished, and only the gospel gives us a means to avoid the fate we deserve. In a more immediate context, Solomon is highlighting the fact that getting involved with sinners leads only to personal destruction. Falling into the temptations of sin never ends well, even when it seems to start well. No good can come from these wicked plans. Both the Book of Proverbs and other scriptures will emphasize the importance of choosing one's company very carefully, Proverbs 13 verse 20, 1 Corinthians 15 verse 33. Verse 19. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain, it takes away the life of its possessors. Those who have read the myth of King Midas will recognize the point of this proverb. King Midas wished for nothing more than gold. His greed was immense, even though he already had everything he could want. By chance, he was given the ability to have one wish granted. He wished that everything he touched would turn into gold. This scheme quickly turned into a curse when his clothes, food, and drink all became cold, hard metal. Even his daughter turned into a gold statue. Midas suffered greatly for his selfish wish, and ruined his royal life. Midas' greed was for unjust gain. He wanted what he did not deserve, did not earn, and didn't really need. He made a stupid, thoughtless choice based on insatiable greed. This act would eventually take away his life, just as Solomon tells us here. Those who try to get ahead through sin and evil will find that they've lost everything. This includes what they thought they were gaining, and everything they had beforehand, Mark 8 verses 36 to 38. Verse 20. Wisdom cries aloud in the street, in the markets she raises her voice. Verse 20 paints a picture of wisdom, personified as a woman, crying out in the marketplace. The reason for staging this image in the marketplace is visibility. The market is a crowded, public area, one where everyone in the community needs to go. In other words, Solomon is suggesting that wisdom is accessible to anyone and everyone who actually wants it. And, because she cries aloud and raises her voice in a public place, even those who aren't specifically seeking her are going to encounter her, at least by accident. Wisdom does not hide itself. It is clear and present. Even those who don't seek wisdom will stumble into it, at times. The only way to completely avoid wisdom is to purposefully ignore it. There is a contrast here between wisdom and the sins Solomon described in verses 11 to 14. Sin is enticing, in a get-rich-quick sense. Wisdom is available and accessible to anyone, but it also requires work. Context summary: Proverbs 1 verses 20 to 33 concludes the first chapter of Proverbs with the dire consequences of the behaviors defined in the previous section. Also, in this segment is the first personification of wisdom as a female. Throughout Proverbs, Solomon likens wisdom to a woman crying out. The theme is that she is not hiding but is out in the open for all to hear, even though she often goes overlooked. Verse 21. At the head of the noisy streets she cries out, at the entrance of the city gates she speaks. This verse continues the picture begun in verse 20. Wisdom is crying out to all, in a public and busy place. Many people can hear her cries. The streets are busy, the gate is crowded, yet the people are going on about their business. Even though wisdom is available to them and calling out to them, they pass her by without notice. Proverbs 1 verse 22. The imagery Solomon uses is no accident. A woman calling out in a busy public place will be seen and heard, essentially, by everyone in the community. Whether they are looking for her or not, everyone will have to make a decision about her offer. Spiritually speaking, no one has the excuse to claim they never had any opportunity to gain wisdom. This echoes other scriptures which indicate that God will always give us enough knowledge to make the right decision, Romans 1 verses 18 to 20, Matthew 7 verse 7. The fact that we don't listen to wisdom is entirely our own fault. In the case of wisdom, even those not looking for her will have an opportunity to meet her. The only way one can completely avoid wisdom is by purposefully choosing to ignore it. Verse 22. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? Verse 21 suggested that wisdom, pictured as a woman, was crying out in busy and crowded places. The depiction of a woman shouting in a marketplace implies that everybody has an opportunity to encounter wisdom. A person either accepts wisdom or purposefully ignores it. While verse 23 refers to one who does respond, most of this passage addresses those who refuse to listen. Verse 22 clearly states that this, deliberately snubbing wisdom, is exactly what is happening. Wisdom is crying out, but the people ignore her for their own selfish and foolish desires. It has been said that there is no such thing as invincible ignorance. Any lack of knowledge can be overcome. The problem is not that we cannot know, but that we don't want to know. When we see how the godless world reacts to tragedy, morality, and conflict, we often see this exact principle in action. People would rather love being simple than act in wisdom. As with verse 4, the term simple does not mean stupid. Rather, it means one who is uninformed or ignorant. The word scoffer is from the Hebrew lesem, meaning a person who mocks or speaks arrogantly. This is a person who sneers at wisdom, makes fun of it, or laughs at it, instead of listening to it. This same attitude is reflected in verses such as Isaiah 28 verse 22, Psalm 119 verse 51, and Proverbs 14 verse 9. Verse 23. If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you, I will make my words known to you. To this point, wisdom has been imagined as a woman shouting out in a crowded marketplace. This is a scenario where everyone in the community is forced to either listen to or ignore the voice of the woman. Most people, according to verse 22, prefer to love being simple. In literal terms, these are the people who prefer to be ignorant. Here we see the benefits available to those who will stop and listen. Amidst all of the confusion, the crowds, the bustle of activity, some will stop to listen and accept these difficult words. These are the people who hear what wisdom says and believe. This also means turning away from the sinful temptations of verses 11 to 14. To such people, wisdom will give knowledge freely. Solomon tells us that wisdom will be poured out to them. In the New Testament, this concept is furthered by James when he states, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him." James 1 verse 5. Verse 24. Because I have called and you refuse to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded. Verse 23 encouraged those who will listen to wisdom. Wisdom is pictured as a woman shouting out her message in a crowded, public place. This is an offer being made to anyone and everyone. And all people are being given the opportunity to hear it. Nobody is being left with an excuse to say, "I didn't know." To those who listen, God will give wisdom, James 1 verse 5. This single verse explains the rewards for those who respond. Verse 24 quickly reverts from this positive turn. This verse introduces the fate of those who pass by and do not listen. Note, according to the context of this passage, there are only two possible responses to wisdom. The imagery Solomon uses means all people are being exposed to this offer. A person can only choose between listening to wisdom and ignoring her. There is no way anyone can claim they were unaware of this offer. Romans 1 verses 18 to 20. Here Solomon sets the stage for the consequences that are coming to those who are enticed by sin and do not listen to wisdom. Verse 25. Because you have ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof. Prior verses have described the offer of wisdom given to all people. Wisdom is imagined as a woman calling out in a crowded, public place. The only way to avoid her is to ignore her. Those who listen will be blessed. Unfortunately, as seen in verse 22, many people purposefully choose ignorance. Many people in the world would rather not know. Verse 25 gives a deeper sense of this rebellion. Those who turn away from wisdom are not simply choosing another path. They are ignoring, disregarding, or neglecting her advice, deliberately choosing not to consider what she says. The phrase, "would have none of it," as in the ESV and NKJV, is very descriptive. When a person insists on rejecting every single part of a message, we say they are having none of it. Those who are ignoring wisdom, according to this passage, are like those described in verse 18. They have already started down the path of wickedness, and they refuse to hear anything from wisdom to turn them from sin. Verse 26. I also will laugh at your calamity, I will mock when terror strikes you. The main consequence of ignoring wisdom is not that bad things might happen. The main consequence is that bad things are assured to happen. Once we have made a poor choice, it is too late to appeal for wisdom. Wisdom is the right action, based in knowledge. Calamity, or disaster, comes from the wrong action based in selfish desire. In this passage, Solomon has personified wisdom as a woman. This verse explains one reason why, once the opportunity to act wisely has passed by, wisdom laughs and mocks. Few things are as humiliating or shaming as being ridiculed and taunted. In that day, when women were often considered of lesser status, it would have been especially humiliating to imagine a woman jeering publicly at a man. Imagery aside, the spiritual application works both for men and women. The sense of a mocking here has more to do with remembering the advice that was ignored. There is a reason why we, as human beings, find it so irritating to hear someone else tell us, "I told you so." Rather than being pursued, wisdom was ignored, and the consequences are nobody's fault but our own. This applies both to Christian believers and non-believers alike. Actions have consequences. A person can have a saving relationship with Christ and still fail to listen to wisdom. The same aftermath is waiting for anyone who acts foolishly, Christian or not. Verse 27. When terror strikes you like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind when distress and anguish come upon you. The imagery of this verse hints at the reality of cause and effect. God sometimes intervenes in His creation through miracles. Most of the time, though, he allows the universe he has designed to function exactly as it was designed to. A primary theme of the Book of Proverbs is that we do, in fact, have opportunities to reduce our suffering. This is the purpose of God-given wisdom. All too often, we ignore what God has told us, and then complain about the results. But if we ignore wisdom, we're throwing ourselves on the mercy of chance and consequences. Cause and effect are not something we can escape, whether we follow Christ or not. Following the foolish ways of sin and temptation absolutely guarantees that calamity and terror will ensue. This passage, especially verses 26 and 27, is a stark reminder that when we purposefully ignore wisdom, we can't rightly demand sympathy. Verse 28. Then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently but will not find me. This verse reinforces that idea that the time to seek wisdom is before acting, not after. As human beings, we have a bad habit of acting foolishly, and only then asking, "Oh, no, what do I do now?" In truth, that was the question we should have asked before we got into trouble. When the consequences of our bad choices are staring us in the face, we suddenly become motivated. We analyze and scheme and plan. True wisdom is choosing the right path, and considering the consequences, before we're faced with disaster. Instead of trying to wheedle our way out of bad outcomes, we should be focused on listening to wisdom and avoiding them entirely. When we experience dire consequences, we often look back and wish we had made the right choice. We think back to when wisdom called out to us and we ignored her. The expression, hindsight is 20/20, is a reflection of this section of the Book of Proverbs. We never see the wisdom of wisdom more clearly than when we're in the middle of distress, caused by ignoring it. This also echoes back to verse 26, where the memory of good advice not taken is haunting. Verse 29. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. Proverbs 1 verse 7 is the key verse for the entire book. Verse 29 emphasizes how ignoring this crucial tip results in catastrophe. True wisdom is always grounded in a healthy, respectful, reverent fear of God. When we choose not to fear the Lord, when we choose not to place Him in His proper place in our lives, we despise knowledge and refuse to act wisely. The use of terms such as hate and despise in these passages needs to be understood in context. Writings of this time and place often used extreme contrasts to make a point. In this case, those who preferred to be ignorant, rather than follow the truth, are said to hate knowledge. This isn't meant in an absolute or overly literal sense. In symbolic terms, and as used in this type of literature, it means that they rejected knowledge, true knowledge, which is rooted in respect for God, in favor of something else. Verse 30. Would have none of my counsel and despised all my reproof. Here, the depths of our rejection of wisdom is explored. Solomon has described wisdom as a woman in a crowded, public place, shouting out for everyone to hear. The only way to avoid hearing her words is to purposefully ignore them. In other words, ignorance is always a choice, in one sense or another. God gives us enough to begin our search, Romans 1 verses 18 to 20, and promises to give us what we need when we seek Him, Matthew 7 verse 7. When we refuse to listen to wisdom or refuse to start with the fear of the Lord, it is as if wisdom was dead to us. We ignore her as if she was not even there. We pass by her and follow foolish pursuits. We fall into the trap of sin. Even those who know Christ as their Savior are still subject to the consequences of their choices. Cause and effect still apply, and the best way to avoid the risks of chance is to take advice coming from a godly perspective. Verse 31. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way and have their fill of their own devices. This verse is a fairly direct statement that choices have consequences, Galatians 6 verse 7. We have various ways of saying this in modern English. You've made your own bed, now you have to lie in it. Your chickens are coming home to roost. You mess with the bull, you get the horns. And so on and so forth. Wisdom cries out for anyone who is willing to listen, only those who ignore her fail to learn from wisdom, Proverbs 1 verse 24. When we do that, we will have to live with the consequences. What happens when we ignore the wisdom of God, Proverbs 1 verse 7, is entirely our own fault. What comes from sin is our own choice and our own doing. This is a major theme of the first chapter of Romans, which explains that when we choose to reject God, God will let us have it our way, including all of the painful and embarrassing results. Every opportunity is before us to follow the Lord. Solomon is preparing us for the consequences that will follow when we choose to go our own way. Verse 32. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. There are only two ways to respond to wisdom: to listen or to turn away. Either one is a choice. The image of wisdom as a woman publicly shouting in the marketplace applies to all of us. Nobody has an excuse. Wisdom is made available, all we have to do is choose to listen. Sadly, most people will not, and the end of this road leads to destruction. Solomon was greatly blessed by God with wisdom, but even wisdom is only the capacity to make the right choices. Solomon knew firsthand what happens when a person ignores wisdom and makes the wrong choices. The book of Ecclesiastes is his description of this painful discovery. Despite all of the wealth and pleasure, Solomon found going his way, instead of God's way, to be vanity, or meaningless, in the end. There is no eternal significance in sinful desires and foolish ways. Refusing to act wisely leads to consequences, something which even saved believers are subject to. Verse 33. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease, without dread of disaster. The Bible is not naive about the world we live in. Proverbs, as a book of wisdom, is meant to be viewed in context with the rest of the Bible. Ecclesiastes explores the observations of a man who sees that good and evil deeds are not always, perfectly, at all times, associated with positive or negative results. The book of Job agonizes over the unfairness of life and human experience. At the same time, just as the statements in the book of Proverbs are meant to be general, the theme is general, as well. Those who ignore wisdom may or may not experience disaster right now, but they will, inescapably, pay a price for their actions. Likewise, this verse seems to acknowledge that the way of the wise is a hard road, in its own way. It is often traveled alone. It means resisting the seduction of sin. But those who are wise rest in the security of the Lord. They have no reason to fear the eternal disaster awaiting those who ignore God. And they are far more likely to experience joy, peace, and success in this mortal life. End of Proverbs 1. Please note: the material used in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.